Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for being with us here today. This is a webinar for school community engagement in the time of COVID, specifically to learn more about the School Climate Leadership Certification. And I'm really excited to have you join us. I'm excited to have a panel of incredible folks who are going to give some more color and context to that School Climate Certification. Before we dive in, I want to just share a little bit more about who who we are, what our organization is about. And so you have folks that are affiliated with Ramapo for Children and the National School Climate Center at Ramapo. The National School Climate Center merged with Ramapo for Children in 2019, and the organizations are very aligned. We're both committed to creating safe, inclusive, equitable, and engaging learning environments for everyone. Ramapo for Children as an organization has really deep background in training professionals. We've been around for 98 years. We run a series of direct services program out of an upstate campus in Rhinebeck, New York. And then we do a lot of training and educating for teachers in New York City, public schools, private schools, charter schools, as well as across the country. And we really ground our expertise in racial equity, inclusion of children with disabilities, restorative justice, trauma, SEL. I think there's a lot of different modalities and lenses that we use. And then NSCC at Ramapo is deeply focused on research and analysis of key dimensions of school climate, providing research-based resources, solutions, and coaching for leaders, and contributing to discourse to make sure that school climate continues to be something that's top of mind and top of priority for people as they're making decisions and plans for education and educational institutions. And I'm going to pause for 1 second and the PowerPoint so that we can focus on welcoming our panelists. So first we have Phil Brown, who's a PhD, who's a senior practice consultant for NSCC at Ramapo, and he's also a fellow at the Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology at Rutgers. He founded and directed the Center for Social and Character Development there. And Phil has led, coached, and worked in education for over 30 years, both in school climate and a multitude of other key areas in education. He's founder and president of the New Jersey Alliance for Social, Emotional, and Character Development. He's a member of the National School Climate Council, and he's co-editor of the Handbook of Pro-Social Education. So welcome, Phil. We're thrilled to have you. We also have Carissa Noel, who is a program administrator in the Office of Professional Development and Curriculum in Berks County, at the Berks County Intermediate Unit, which is an educational services agency supporting 18 school districts in southeastern Pennsylvania. And so Carissa works as an instructional coaching mentor and a school climate regional coordinator for Berks County. In her career, she's been an elementary educator. She's led K-12 implementation of a science curriculum. She's also led a grassroots climate improvement effort. And her graduate work at Lehigh University also focused on school climate, which led her to receive a level 2 school climate leadership certification with National School Climate Center. So she is someone who can speak about the experience of going through the school climate certification. And I should have said, Phil is a coach for the school climate certification, so he's someone that can speak to coaching and going through that process. And then currently, Carissa facilitates school climate improvement efforts for 6 schools and leads a school climate focused network group with 10 school districts in Pennsylvania. So we also have Dr. Stacy Molnar-Main, who is an experienced educator with a track record of building and leading vibrant learning communities that support improvements in school climate, as well as social and emotional learning and democratic engagement. She is currently a school climate consultant for the Pennsylvania Department of Education, where she leads a statewide network supporting school climate improvement in Pennsylvania's 500 school districts. And she's also author of the 2018 book, Deliberation in the Classroom, Supporting Critical Thinking, Community, and Citizenship in Schools. And finally, we have Hannah Miller, who is the Director of Program Design and Expansion at Ramapo for Children. She oversees curriculum content for Ramapo training, and she manages internal professional development for Ramapo staff and trainers across school climate assessment, classroom engagement, leadership development, experiential learning, and more and more and more. Throughout her career, Hannah served in a variety of roles at Ramapo, including Master Trainer, Associate Director of Camp Ramapo, which is a residential summer camp for children with social, emotional, and learning challenges at our Rhinebeck campus, one of our direct service programs, as I mentioned. And before coming to Ramapo, Hannah worked as an after-school program director and also as an administrator in a Bronx-based school for English language learners. So again, I just want to thank each of our panelists. We also have some folks that are not going to be on camera, but they're in the background, you know, supporting with tech and things like that. So I want to acknowledge and appreciate that staff. And finally, I'm here as your moderator. I'm Mishara Brooks. I'm Chief of Staff and Associate Director of Strategy and Implementation at Ramapo. I support with strategy across the organization, helping think through our programs, and have been excited to be working on the School Climate Leadership Certification and working with and learning from everyone here about how we can improve it, tweak it, and have it to be offered to all of you all. So with that, before we dive into questions to our panelists, I want to, I'm going to bring up the PowerPoint again and just give a little bit of overview about the School Climate Leadership Certification. There we go. Okay. So the high-level goal for the SCLC, as you'll hear us refer to it, is to equip a critical mass of education leaders with the knowledge and competencies necessary to sustain a school climate. So to us, school climate is something that really does have to be both top-down and bottom-up, which is why we've worked with leaders at all levels, both within schools, within districts, at the state level. And the certification for leaders that opt into it really is trying, as I'm saying, to build their knowledge so that they, with whatever their sphere of influence is, they can be a part of creating and sustaining a positive school climate. And we do that through really focusing in on a school leader's role or a district leader's role to build capacity and so that they have the ability to address technical aspects of school climate improvement process. And they do a lot of study, as it says here, school climate research, theory, practice. And there's a 5-stage climate improvement process that essentially people are coached to learn about and then to go through. We've had people from all over the country participate in the School Climate Leadership Certification, and we're excited to welcome you all. We know that there are people from all over the country here with us today. So today, to say just a little bit more in terms of specifics, the course that's launching in the fall is 18 to 24 months, and it includes 14 coaching calls with your SCLC leadership coach, as well as those guided modules, as I said, that have readings so you can learn about the climate improvement process and develop knowledge about different implementation tools and policy information. You'll do 2 deep dives into special topics in school climate, and you'll also undergo a guided reflection on that 5-stage school climate improvement process that culminates in a case study that you are engaging in within your school or within a school that you're supporting in order to really, really, really see that process play out and how you can implement it. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing again. And I'm going to turn to asking some questions of our panelists. And we're going to spend about 25 minutes in Q&A with the panelists, and then we want to leave a good amount of time at the end for you all to ask questions as well. So to open, this is a question I would like each of our panelists to answer, but how does the changed landscape of education impact what leaders need to understand about school climate? You know, the fact that given that we're in post-pandemic or still in pandemic times, schools may be happening virtually all or some of the time, that if people are in school in any amount of time, they're entering after education has been interrupted and that they're having months without being together in school communities. So Phil, why don't we start with you and answer to that question?
Thanks, Mishara. The fact is that the core concepts of school climate are really what is at the heart of making schools caring institutions. And there's no time that we need caring institutions more than right now. We really believe that schools that have pro-social school cultures and climates are better prepared to address the needs that are coming forth right now. And as we navigate the difficult time in the next few months, we think that schools that appreciate those concepts and understand how to engage staff and students in learning how to better meet these challenges are going to be well prepared and be better able to meet these challenges.
Thank you. And Stacey, what would you add to that? I mean, how should schools be thinking about being well prepared to meet these challenges, especially in virtual context?
Sure. Well, I would say one of the things that we learned early on in our statewide school climate improvement work was that one of the most often overlooked components of school climate improvement are teachers and teachers' needs and teacher engagement. Teachers play an integral role in setting the tone in the building and working together to create the type of pro-social climate that supports learning. And yet, in order to do that, they have, we need to pay attention to what their climate is like, how they're feeling supported, the goals that they have for their students and for their own work, and the shared vision under which we're all operating. And right now during COVID, it's a particularly challenging time because all of that has been disrupted. And so on one hand, we may still share the same vision for a positive school climate that we had when we were face to face, but there are likely things that take precedent right now. Wellness, support, the flow of information is really critical, and these all impact school climate. So I would say it's super important right now because our teachers need us to pay attention to it.
And then Carissa, I know, by nature of your role, you're in conversations with schools and school leaders that are trying to think about what they're going to be doing at the start of the school year and how it's going to look this year. What would you add to what Phil and Stacy have shared about school climate in that conversation?
It's interesting to watch this sort of brainstorming and planning process that schools are going through. And I do notice that the schools who seem to be having a little bit more of a seamless time are those that have built a really strong climate and have built really strong relationships with their communities, their teachers. They're looking for input. And I think that's the power of utilizing and leveraging a school climate approach right now. We don't know what the right answers are. I think everyone is pretty confident and open about that it's tough to say, this is exactly how we should proceed. And I don't think we'll need to course correct on this path. It's just not like that right now. And so I think leveraging relationships with all stakeholders, inviting voices from respective groups is so critical. And leaders who take on a school climate approach do just that. And they really remember to build strong lines of communication and lean on them. So that even though some community members might not agree necessarily with decisions that are made going forward, they're heard, they're respected and valued. And then leaders can really be confident that you're not moving forward alone. You don't have to just stand up there and say, this is how it's happening and that's it. You have a team around you, you have a family, and it's a much stronger way to go into something so difficult.
Yep. And then Hannah, I know by virtue of your role, you've been in the weeds with partners who work in a variety of different, you've been in conversations that are happening across districts, that are happening across public and private, public and charter environments, that are happening across schools, OST organizations, and other types of direct service organizations. How are you seeing school climate come up, and are you seeing it as something that people are thinking about?
Yeah, what has struck me both in this conversation and in conversations with partners is that we're sort of holding two things at once. That this is a time of deep uncertainty, some profound traumas that have impacted our communities, and also a time of really profound opportunity. There's the novelist, I believe it's Arundhati Roy, she wrote this piece in April where she refers to the pandemic as a portal, and the opportunity to reimagine what school looks like, what our relationships are like what is exciting and hopeful to me is that this is such a brilliant moment to listen really deeply and to re-engage in the relationships and connections and pay attention to all of these factors that are going to help us heal together and are also going to prepare us to do some really deep learning and come up with something new about what school can look like and feel like and be like. So it's both very deeply uncertain, but I think also a really exciting time to be thinking about school climate.
Yeah, there's a lot of potential. And I think to your, to points that everyone has made here, I think there's also a lot of power in people who have different roles and come from different perspectives to be able to be a part of shaping that. So I know we, one of the questions is whether or not, as we start talking more specifically about the school climate leadership certification, who is the kind of right person to step into that? And I think that one of the things that you all each bring is a perspective of, it has been something that has been school leaders. It's been people that are supporting school leaders and working with school leaders from a different from a district perspective. We have some partners that we know are going to be joining the program in the fall that are supporting, you know, not from a district perspective, but just from like an additional kind of they're outside of schools, but they're a school support agency and organization because of partnerships between the district and this organization. So you can have a lot of different entry points into the conversation and still benefit a lot from learning about school climate and trying to shape it and improve it, whatever your role is and however you interface with schools. And so I think to dive a little bit even more deeply into that, you know, Phil, I'd love to say, as I said, you've got decades of experience in school climate work. What do you think makes the school climate leadership certification unique in equipping people, school system leaders, and those that are supporting and interfacing with those leaders to be able to move the needle and actually make a change in school climate?
Well, I think it's going to be useful to go back and talk a little bit about the history of where the certificate came from, which helped perhaps give some context. It was almost 8 years ago that there was a little think tank that the National School Climate Center gathered together to consider what we could do to advance the school climate field. And there were two things that really motivated us when we thought about what we wanted to do. The first was that our knowledge and experience about the power of school climate had grown, about what works to provide genuine and lasting improvements in schools and the lives of students. The second was that not much of that knowledge and experience was reflected in the professional preparation that educators were receiving. So the craft knowledge that's really essential to the success of school leaders, particularly, was not being transmitted very effectively, we thought. And there was no professional or academic credential that supported that learning for working educators in the way we thought that it should and could. Mm-hmm. At the core of our research and experience was the fact that schools are systems and microcosms of the larger society. And successfully improving schools means engaging all parts of the school community. Improvement depends on building social trust, and a critical tool in doing that is measuring school climate, gauging perceptions and experiences of students, teachers, and parents around the critical factors such as physical and emotional safety, and whether they feel supported by the learning environment and their leadership. The quality of relationships and communications, those are all things that we knew were critical to really making a difference. And then figuring out how to use that information along with other qualitative data and engage in concerted, transparent, and sustained process of planning and problem solving, that sequence was really the core of what we knew could really make a difference. What we decided is to construct a process, the School Climate Leadership Certification process, that was designed around those core concepts, and then provide school leaders with access both to the solid research and consultation opportunities to coaching in their current professional context, so that we could structure the opportunity to test what they were learning and to develop new skills and improve their schools in the process.
And so what I'm hearing you say is that part of what makes the School Climate Leadership Certification unique is all of that genesis, right? That it's really informed by thinking holistically about what does it mean to, like, how do you even think about climate? What is this impact? And then how do you think about being able to change it? And now let's create something that's really dedicated and focused on that. And informed by what we know about how that then impacts all the other things that happen within schools, how it impacts how people show up, how it impacts their safety, emotionally, mentally, physically, how it impacts their ability and their openness to show up and be ready to learn, how it impacts teachers, you know, what they're bringing into the school building and their ability to show up and teach, so that the quality of your community and relationships, which I know, Carissa, you've mentioned, really, really, really does impact all these other levers within schools, even though that may not have always been the focus. They're the things running in the background that lift everything. And so, you know, thinking about development, like if you're a leader in interfacing with schools with any way, I think there's a ton of different kinds of professional develop opportunities. And so, Carissa, one of the questions I have for you is, what made you look at this particular one and say, I have 1,000,001 things already on my plate, but this seems like a worthwhile thing to add because of what it'll enable me to do?
It's interesting because when I first started in my current position, I saw it exactly how you just said, 1,000,001 things on a list. And how on earth am I going to support all of these schools and all of these different initiatives and projects? What I really, really quickly learned was that school climate is not a thing on the list. School climate is in everything, and everything is in school climate. It's interesting in my work, even though I might be talking about instructional coaching or STEM or school improvement, there is rarely a meeting or a presentation that goes by where I'm not mentioning something relating to school climate, because it really is so key to the success of any initiative, to the success and strength of relationships, projects, planning. It shows up in everything. And so what I have found is that not only has it really helped the work that I do, of course, in school climate, this leadership certification was just a really powerful learning opportunity in general. And it's really helped in my interactions with schools as they seek to improve climate. But it's really just lifted the level of, I think, the work that I do in general and the relationships I have with schools in general, because of that really strong improvement framework, the relationships I've built through. You know, I was lucky enough to have Phil as a coach. I have to shout that out real quickly. And I say now that I kind of have a mini Phil on my shoulder when I go into the meetings and interactions with schools. I mean, that powerful coaching is something that I will never, ever lose. And so I've done lots of professional learning. You know, beyond being a provider, I've engaged in lots of professional learning, and this by far was one of the strongest experiences. The resources, the coaching, they're just unmatched, and they really do make you a stronger leader and educator in every way beyond just climate.
Thank you. And yes, Phil, did you know that? Did you realize that you're a mini Phil on Carissa's shoulder, that coaching relationship didn't end just when you stopped talking to her as regularly?
That's every teacher's fondest hope.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And Hannah, I think, you know, because you've done a lot of work with school climate, you know, within Ramapo, not necessarily in the certification, but just as we would go in and talk to schools about school climate, can you talk a little bit about, you know, just getting to that point of recognizing, because I think we would go in initially years ago and it'd be like, okay, we're going to train teachers in, you know, these classroom management strategies or building relationship strategies. And eventually as an organization, I think we started to see, wait, there's something broader here that we need to be addressing and working on. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, just the interplay between, you know, the school climate leadership certification and how that aligns with the work that we've seen and done in schools?
Absolutely. You know, having worked very directly with teachers on teacher practices and worked with principals and thinking more systemically how to establish the broad vision of what is happening in schools, how people are experiencing those schools, what we believe to be true, and what we value in our education, and how we can align the broader practices to that. I have found that it is doing everyone a disservice if you separate those two, and that that these two things really do go hand in hand. And as I look at the school climate leadership certification, what I see this doing and sort of setting us up for is providing the tools and knowledge base and coaching to engage whole school communities in moving the needle on school climate and in uplifting the voices that have historically been very marginalized or ignored. And that is critically important. And I think that there's a suite of services that Ramapo has that in the work with individual teachers, or we can think too about what does this look like when you're actually in a classroom or in a classroom on Zoom. What do these big ideas look like in the way that we interact with our young people, the way that we interact with each other, the way that we speak about young people and the way that we speak about their families and see ourselves as members of that community. So I think there's an opportunity to really pull together both theoretical understandings of systems and understanding the importance and the sort of larger moving pieces with understanding the reality of schools happen in real time and happen and are sort of the sum total of all these interactions. So it's a really exciting marriage that I see between those two big ideas.
Yeah, and you talk about systems, you know, happening within a school, and then Stacy, you're thinking about systems at a state level. And so, you know, as Pennsylvania was delving more into school climate and wanting their leaders and people to have deeper understanding of school climate throughout the state, what made you look at the school climate leadership certification through NSCC and think that this was a worthwhile and a good use, you know, a good way to build that knowledge for your district leaders?
Sure. So much of what people have already talked about was recognized here in Pennsylvania. We had made a lot of progress on standards-based reform as a way of approaching school improvement. We were beginning to recognize that there were a lot of other pieces to the puzzle, and we really needed a broader lens to begin to think about school improvement. Because what we were finding in many of our schools where things were either looking good or things were not working well when they were implementing the types of improvements that were best practices was that the underlying issue was that it was a unhealthy school climate or that it was just a climate that was being ignored, assuming that it just is something that develops if you're doing the an evidence-based reading program, and it isn't. And it can actually, the research that we were reading, it can actually improve those implementations if you're paying attention to the quality of relationships, to the quality of supports, to the way that we communicate and interact, to social and emotional learning, all of these elements that would not be pulled together if not talking about school climate as the plate. And so from a systems level, we couldn't just approach that by saying school climate and assume that everyone had the same understanding of that. We really needed to approach it systematically. And so the school climate leadership certificate gave us a way to build capacity in each of our intermediate units or service agencies that provide technical assistance to schools so that we were talking this common language. We were using the same set of tools as a way to bring in these other very important concepts. It's been a real entry point for us in moving the lever on equity and conversations around equity in schools, as well as trauma-informed practices. So we feel like because we adopted a really systematic approach where we were using a strategic planning process that attended to readiness, data, evidence-based practices, all of those elements under the umbrella of school climate improvement, that we are really poised right now as we're responding to COVID to be able to pull from that expertise and really engage folks like Clarissa in the field to help schools respond to those climate needs, continuing their planning processes, even though it'll mean that they have to pivot a little bit and adopt new strategies based upon the current data, but they really do have a framework to work from.
Yeah. Well, and Phil, you know, to Stacey's point about the links with equity and the links with trauma-informed lenses and just kind of what it is to be able to give someone a framework of an improvement process and then walk through that. Could you talk a little bit more about your role as coach in doing that, and have you seen, I guess, those kinds, and how you see those revelations play out for leaders that as you're coaching them, how they start to see the interconnectedness of school climate with these other elements?
Well, I think it's important to know that one of the first things we were unsure about and really understood as we worked on this for 5 years was that people with professionals with various kinds of education backgrounds and training can successfully become champions of school climate. So it's as long as you have a real grounding in your role as an educator. And bring that experience with you, that we've been successful working with people from a variety of different kind of backgrounds. So I think that's important for people to know. As I thought about my role as a coach, I really relied on my experience in adult development and really tried to work hard on focusing on the strengths of the learner as we made progress through the modules that are at the heart of the school climate leadership certification process. And trying to look at understanding the challenges that each individual person faced in terms of both the actual role that they were currently serving, whether it was in an intermediate role as essentially a consultant to schools like Clarissa is, or actually a school principal or leader in other ways. Schools are complex places, and yet what we offer through the coaching environment is a safe place to explore the opportunities and challenges that our learners are experiencing. And I think that's really important. And that's why the social trust that we build with them, we try to essentially model the same level and the kind of relationships we think are important in the school themselves. oftentimes I think I'm been most effective when I'm really providing a space for active listening to occur and looking at how do you arrive at mutual understanding of the barriers to effective change, such as punitive discipline systems that have inadvertently contributed to economic and racial disparities. And then we look at how a supportive school culture based on respect and dignity can change the lived experiences of the children and adolescents and staff who work and grow together together in school. The other thing that I think it's important to recognize, especially now that I have Clarissa and Stacy listening in, is that what I've really grown in as a coach in the interaction with the learners. So it's that mutuality is a two-way street. I continually learn from coaching people and take that learning on to the next experience with the next learner. And so I think that's again, something we try to look for as a model in our coaching.
Yeah. Yep, and it's really powerful. And I know, Hannah, thinking specifically about, the SCLC that's launching this fall, that in addition to the interaction and relationship with the coach, that there's also very intentionally a cohort model built into it. Can you just talk a little bit more, I think, building on what Phil said about the thinking behind that?
Absolutely. As a former administrator, I was oftentimes convinced that whatever was happening in my school was either the best thing that had ever happened or the absolute worst. And learned later that neither of those was ever true.
Right.
But particularly at this moment, but I think always, that the opportunity to be in conversation with other people in other schools, in other districts who are doing this work and are thinking about these ideas, that there is just something really powerful and potentially transformative about that. And so built into the structure of this program are at least 4 gatherings with people within your cohort to discuss the opportunities that you're finding, the questions you're encountering, to talk about the research, to explore more deeply the impact of some of this research is in different contexts, and to share some stories. So we also understand that we are neither the best nor the worst at any given moment, but also as an opportunity to produce brand new ideas as a collective. So we're really excited. I'm super excited to be listening and a part of this very selfishly, because I think there's a lot of power that can come from it.
Yeah, and Stacey, you've already talked about how having that shared language and frameworks that have set, the state and all the intermediate units and leaders up throughout it to be able to respond to something entirely unanticipated like COVID in a different way. I'd love to, hear you talk a little bit more of that, and you as well, Carissa. I know that in your work, with these leaders, like just trying to understand, maybe sharing some concrete examples of impact that you've seen as a result of SCLC. Stacey, both from what you've seen kind of across intermediate units and across the state, and Carissa, what you've seen in your work with schools, as well as in the network school climate meetings that you're leading. So maybe Stacey, we can start with you.
Sure. I would say that there's 3 things that we have found that we could attribute to our greater attention to the school climate improvement process statewide. One is that our schools are using school climate data at higher rates than they ever have. So we had a Pennsylvania school climate survey, and every year we've administered it since we started staffing and supporting the school climate improvement process. Using the certification, we've seen increased numbers of schools using that survey, which is great because data, we need to be using data, even though we're talking about a lot of soft skills that people think of. We can get data points on them, and we need to use that. We're also seeing climate show up in schools' comprehensive plans. So they're required to do comprehensive plans as part of a mandate. Oftentimes those address professional development and technology and a range of issues. We're starting to see climate built into those comprehensive plans that are coming back at the state level. And then finally, we are seeing increased receptiveness to topics like equity, trauma-informed practices, et cetera. Schools coming to the table, attending trainings, hosting their own workshops to try to develop capacity in those areas that they have identified through intentional work around school climate.
Thank you. And then Carissa, just from your lens and your experience, in terms of impact, what have you seen?
I think schools who have started to engage with school climate improvement or just taken that on as a focus seem to be aware right now that even though this is a time of many unknowns, there is evidence around what types of things are effective in some scenarios that can be used. We're not completely in the dark here. And that's one of the things I really valued about the leadership certification was its heavy emphasis on evidence. Yes, this is a soft skill kind of, as Stacy just referenced, this is a lot to do with how we think and feel, but we do know some things about what's effective. And so leaders who have engaged with this a little bit seem to be leaning back on that. What does the data say? What is our survey show that our community members think, but what practices are effective in a virtual environment? What practices are effective when a community has undergone trauma? Because right now we are seeing quite a bit of that. There are protocols we can use that come from the work of the National School Climate Center that can be super helpful in navigating this. And then they also seem to recognize really the importance of working with a team really effectively, having a really cohesive team, and knowing that having a strong team when we're paving the way in a pandemic like this, it's not always perfect and things aren't always tied up with a neat little bow at the end of every meeting, that we have to lean into the vulnerability and trust in the process and know that we will grow together and we will get there, and it's not perfect, but the most important thing is that we all open our hearts, open our ears, listen to one another. Those schools that take on that approach and right away opened themselves up to stakeholder feedback and input just seem to be doing quite a bit better with managing the pandemic response.
And which, as you said, those are parts of the school climate improvement process. So even if it's something that is wildly unanticipated, I think there's both okay, we want to change this about climate. We know we want to be paying attention and move the needle in this area. These things are very applicable. And then when there's something unexpected like this, okay, how do we dive into the ambiguity and uncertainty and to be able to have the same practical tool that you can implement, that you can teach, that you can support your staff around. I want to turn now to being able to take some questions from our participants. So thank you all, and please keep sending them in. One of the questions we have, it looks like there's an important thing to recognize is that the environment, the context that we're operating in specifically now, both has the elements of COVID and the trauma that's created. And then we're in a world where there continues to be even more push, vigilance, discussion, and acknowledgement of, racism and oppression and how those operate within educational systems. And so, Hannah, could you speak a little bit to how the SCLC kind of intersects with supporting school leaders and understanding these systems and working to be actively anti-racist, and just kind of how the SCLC supports that?
Absolutely, and there are a couple of things to discuss here. First, it is my belief and the belief of the team who has been working historically and at present in developing the content for the SCLC that to do school climate work without actively doing anti-racist work would perpetuate systems of power and white supremacy and racism. And so while we are offering a component of this work as being a deep dive into thinking about racial equity in schools, that is not the only piece. We've overlaid in all of the modules and continue to do this, and we'll do this as a part of the coaching process, as a continuous learning process as well, but understanding that the only way to look at and understand where power sits in schools and the impact that has on the experiences of young people, of teachers, of administrators, of the whole school community, that requires the development of a racial equity lens. And that is from the very beginning, as we understand and start defining what climate is, to when we think about the things that are impacting what climate is, that our goal is not just to make schools nicer, more smiley racist organizations, but that this is an opportunity for us to transform fundamentally the way that we understand race, power, and the impact that it has on children and young people.
Thank you. Phil, is there anything you'd add to that from your coaching perspective and having coached through these modules before?
Yeah, I think it goes to the heart of the fact that as we move through the process, because we're doing it in real time with real schools, issues always come up, and at the heart of those issues are relationships. And the safe space I talked about, one of the things I do as a coach is try to push a little bit at some of the underlying biases that may be prejudicing how we understand the problems that we're dealing with. So whether it's issues of dealing with folks in a rural area where there are assumptions that don't hold anymore, whether it's a racial equity lens that we're talking about, or simply the power dynamics that are always at play whenever tough decisions are being made, unwrapping those together in a safe space and encouraging people to use perhaps a more mindful approach to how they're dealing with the people in their team, in their school, in the community, is something that where there's no simple answer, but being able to work on it in this space, I think, has shown to be really productive.
And then I think we have, a related question that I think is a little bit more global, but still connected to anti-racist is, the schools and kind of the intersection of schools and Black Lives Matter movement. I think the specific question is, how does the school climate leadership certification interface with schools as being places that recognize the valuation of Black lives in particular, and the ways in which, school systems have been set up in ways that are school systems, discipline systems, I think a lot of different systems, the impact that has had. And I think I'd open that up to anybody, Carissa and Stacy, we just heard from Phil and Hannah, so I'd open that up to either of you, but certainly Phil and Hannah, if there's more you want to add, please feel free.
I'll hop in here if you don't mind. Speaking from a statewide perspective, Pennsylvania has some very diverse, racially diverse areas of it, and it has a lot of areas that are not. And I have heard school administrators over the course of the last few months talk about, Black Lives Matter being a critical thing that we need to be engaging as we bring folks back to school. It's part of the trauma and part of the context in which COVID is occurring. And then I've heard others say that this is an issue that doesn't impact our community. We're just going to focus on COVID. And so, the second response concerns me, and I push on that and engage that. I would say that I am hopeful in situations where those schools where there's not a recognized need or value in engaging with this conversation will be better positioned with a school climate team and not just a single individual in that school raising this issue. The school climate improvement process brings data to the conversation. It deals with the readiness of the adults to begin to tackle issues as much as it begins to deal with kids. And again, I'll go back to where I started. We need to begin with our teachers. And sometimes we don't have the data to show them that this is a need. This is something that we have to tackle. And if we are using a systematic school climate improvement process that is infused with anti-racism, that conversation can be had among the adults in the building. We find that it's sometimes a hard conversation to broach in some of our communities.
Well, and I think that's related to another question we have from participants is, how do we deal with the trauma around the pandemic, or the fears, I guess, that are centering around the pandemic that exist both for staff as well as students, even as you're trying to be in the world of, creating relationship and maintaining relationship and doing that in virtual format. So, I think, I know, Stacey, you talked about how the climate certification set up places to be able to have those conversations, and Carissa, you're having some of those conversations. So how do you, again, think about using the school climate improvement process and using the things that you've learned through the leadership certification program to set up having those conversations, to be able to say with adults, what are your fears and how do we address them? And how do we then as adults be able to interface with students and families and talk about their fears and supporting them?
A couple things. First of all, I will echo again what Stacey said about the power of collecting data around school climate and perceptions, because things will emerge that need to be addressed. And so looking at the data and really working to create a team that does not necessarily take the data personally. Of course, and I always remind teams when I'm working with them that it's normal to feel a little defensive, and that's okay. And a lot of times that means that you really care about something. And So it can sting a little bit sometimes, depending on what you're talking about or considering or the point of view that you're listening to. But the survey and the ability to look at the data, the protocols that are used, really allow the team to build a sort of trust that no matter what we face, we're going to get through it. We're here for each other. We're here to listen. It doesn't mean that nobody's ever going to get upset and have to step out and take a break and whatever. And we need to plan for that and create norms around that. Again, another really strong protocol that can be used through the leadership certification. So the power of data and not really being able to hide from it, but having a way to face it in a very trusting and helpful way. Those are both, I think, really critical pieces there. And then just also through the school climate data collection that you'll go through as part of the leadership certification and an improvement process, we see that some of the sort of check boxes that we were using in schools to say we do trauma, we address trauma, here it is, and this is the program we use or whatever, we might see that that's really not having the impact or the sustained impact that we want on the community. And schools start to realize then through that we actually need a mindset for this, a mindset approach, a way of looking at things that are a little bit different. And a school climate lens, the improvement process and the certification just really lend themselves to helping people to sort of grow that muscle because it's not a program that we can read from. It's a way of thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've heard that before. You know, you move what you measure, right? And there's so many different things within schools that we measure in terms of academic outcomes, in terms of, you know, data and discipline and wanting to see certain numbers go down in terms of attendance. There's all these different things you measure, but having a framework and the habit of being able to measure climate, which does feel, you know, less like, what is the number for climate? Is that a 90? Is it a 70? Like, you know, so learning how to measure it and being able to do it is I think, definitely impactful. And, you know, again, we have an audience of people here who play a variety of roles and come from a variety of, you know, positions of entree in terms of working with schools. And I'd love to just kind of, I think, you know, Hannah and Phil, have you all share again in terms of, you know, I think you've worked with people that have been in a variety of positions as they come into this, and we already have some of that planned for the fall as well. So maybe, Hannah, to start with you, could you just speak to, like, who should do the leadership certification? You know, it's not school principals, but if you're thinking about whether or not this is right for me, what are the kinds of questions you should be asking yourself?
That's a great question. To back up just slightly, when we think about really core to this idea of school climate leadership is not necessarily, it's about sharing power. And so this is not about a certification in knowing that you and you alone can influence everything. That's not true of anybody, even if your title says that you can. That's a lie. That the focus of this is about building a coalition within your school, and not just sort of naming the people who you think are going to agree with you, but bringing together a diverse group of voices and perspectives that are going to help us better understand who we are and who we want to be and help us get there. So I think as you think about your own role, it's important as you go through this process that you would be able to work with people who are decision makers in the school, to convene a group of people to be able to begin this process. So that is something you may want to be thinking about in terms of your relationship with the school you are working with. We've done this certification, and Phil can speak to this more, with community school directors who do not have the hiring, firing capacity that we typically think of as being associated with people who are in charge, but are certainly people who have their finger on the pulse of the school or have the capacity to get closer to having that pulse and understanding what's happening there. And then it could be that you're overseeing a wide variety of schools in this process. And what you want to be thinking about is there a school that I'd be able to get my hands dirty a little bit with? We're not just thinking about how this could impact lots of places, but how do I really understand what this feels like on the ground, even if that might not be my primary job responsibility.
Yeah, and then Phil, actually,
I think,
go ahead, you can answer that, and then we...
I think, I mean, Hannah's captured it really well. I think the key here is this is an applied process. This is while we deal with theory and research, and I was really happy to hear both Chris and Stacy talk about that. It's the ability to work over a couple of years, you know, with the school or schools and try to make a difference in the lives of the staff and the kids. And so that you need to be in a role that will allow you to do that.
And to that point, I think, Phil, this would be a great question for you is, you know, some examples of how going through the school climate certification sets you up to be able to do that. Like, you know, taking care of teachers, for example. The question is, you know, some examples of how you take care of teachers in order to improve school climate. So how is this helping leaders, whatever their entry point again, or their relationship is, be able to bring that lens and those skills to the process?
I think it goes to the heart of one of the fundamental problems with schools as institutions historically is that it's been organized as a top-down process. And what the good school climate fosters and depends on in the end is the ability for people to really collaborate effectively around perceived needs and problems, both of kids and staff. And as Stacy said, if you can engage the staff well, if you've got a toxic environment for the staff, it's going to trickle down to the kids, no matter how good an individual teacher is. And that's what you want is a culture that is supportive of the welfare of all members of the school committee. And if everybody believes that, then you can unwrap some of the things that hide the problems that no one wants to deal with, whether it's racial inequities, economic inequities, or whatever it is. And I think that's at the heart of this process, and why it's so engaging, and why people take a deep breath when they understand that and say, this is why I got into education. I want to be able to make this kind of difference in people's lives. And that means changing the system sometimes.
Well, thank you. And as we come to our last few minutes, which, you know, I think this is flown by, I'd love to ask you all a closing question, and maybe we'll get a couple of other audience questions in as well. But for now, I think just to say, you know, again, for someone who's listening in and considering participation, what advice would you give them? Why is this worth the investment of their time? Again, particularly within all the different demands that people are going to have on their time going into this fall, which will look unlike anything we've seen in recent memory. Why is it worth their time? So Stacey, maybe we start with you.
Sure. I would say it's worth your time because we are all guilty in schools of putting out fires. And we know that there's a raging fire in front of us, right? It's called COVID, and it's created a lot of uncertainties. And yet we also know that we are much more effective when we are engaged in reflective practice and we are proactive. And so what I would say is the leadership certificate is a gift to yourself this year because it will allow you to be intentional and be engaged in reflective practice and have a thought partner in your coach as you're working on a critical issue, which is school climate improvement. Just because school is going to look a lot different this year, the elements of school climate do not change, and they are going to be your partners and friends as you move forward to address students and teachers' needs in the coming year and succeed in getting through this potentially traumatic time.
Thank you. And Carissa, what would you add?
It's definitely worthy of investment of your time. It's one of the most powerful experiences I've had, and I think largely that's because it is so applicable immediately to the work that you do. It is truly one of those experiences that when you engage in some of the learning, you can turn around the next day and apply it. I think you'll also see a lot of personal growth, which is, you know, in the world of education, we love that, we look for that, we crave that, and that's something that's readily available. And the power of the coaching and collaboration is just really unmatched. And to those who are thinking about engaging in this work, the advice I have is just enter into it with your whole heart and your mind. There are a lot of policy pieces and protocols and research that will really help you as far as thinking about this. But if you enter into it wholeheartedly with a really open heart, be prepared to feel a little uncomfortable at times, be prepared to grow and challenge yourself and challenge the people around you, you do see that it impacts schools and teams and community members. And it's one of the most rewarding experiences.
Thank you. And Phil.
I think my colleagues have really said it beautifully. And the only thing I'd add is that it's, I wouldn't still be doing this if it wasn't rewarding experience. And it's really something just to over a period of time that we're able to work with each other, not just for a workshop or a semester, but over a year or two, that's when you can really experience the kind of growth that we all value and cherish.
And that's a part of the reason for the length of the program, right? I think there are certain things, it's like, okay, you come to this workshop or a series of workshops for 3 months and then here you go. But if you really want to affect change, not just in school, I think both in general, like change processes, and then if you want to affect change within the school environments, that really saying we're going to make this, 18 to 24 months is a part of that, is wanting to really be able to dive in deep and understand it and implement it, talk about it, debrief it, try again, just go through all of those different stages and processes. So Hannah, what would you add about why this is worth an investment in people's time, particularly now?
I hate that I had to follow all of that. I think this call has really just summed it up really nicely. I think that I am often in a variety of roles I've had caught in this place where everything's happening very quickly and I end up in a very reactive space. And oftentimes what that means from an administrative perspective is that I want to throw a lot of programs at something and hope that something sticks. And that this process will fundamentally change the way that we approach and understand and bring in resources into our communities. That this starts not by just trying to throw things at an issue or something we perceive to be going on, but it starts with deep listening. And to both Stacey and Chris and Phil's point, this is a really important time to be listening. And the more that we can stop and listen to ourselves and engage in some reflection and some pauses, even amidst all of the crazy and the storm, we'll be better educators and better humans as a result.
Yeah, and especially when we have to do those things, virtually, which again, just adds a whole different element for people and can make it harder sometimes to have I'm sure we've all experienced it as if all the participants, but the separation isn't there in the same degree between, so like carving out time to say, this is the time I'm going to be thinking about this and focusing on this, will continue to be even more important. I think, if to any of our participants, if you have additional questions, I'm going to put up on the screen once again how you can, reach out and get some more information. Just this last slide, and either SCLC at Ramapo for Children with questions or visit ramapoforchildren.org/SCLC. And one question I know that did come in is whether or not we can provide the SCLC in different languages. And I know that for Ramapo, we do have we hire facilitators that have the ability to present in different languages. And so I think if you're interested and you would need or be curious about the ability to go through the SCLC in a different language, please reach out and let's have the conversation about that. And then I want to say again, as I think everyone has touched on, what we're really talking about trying to build is, capacity of many adults, like capacity of a community to engage in this work together. And so we're excited about School Climate Leadership Certification. We thank you for joining us for this time. And we also, are excited about the fact that NSCC and Ramapo are together now because we can do the leadership certification and we can do workshops and coaching and training for teachers and for other staff throughout the school simultaneously so that people's knowledge and skill and comfort and that shared language that Stacey talked about earlier, that common analysis that everyone has referenced, people can really go through that together. So again, thank you all for your time and participation and engagement as panelists. Thank you so much for being here and for your questions and engagements as participants. And if you have any questions, please, again, feel free to visit us at SCLC at ramapoforchildren.org or ramapoforchildren.sclc.